On this day in history, January 14th, 1236, King Henry III of England marries Eleanor of Provence. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the king. Henry III, born 1207, died 1272. King of England, was the eldest son of King John by Isabella of Angoulême. Born on October 1st, 1207, the prince was but 9 years old at the time of his father's death. The greater part of eastern England being in the hands of the French pretender Louis, afterwards Louis VIII, and the rebel barons, Henry was crowned by his supporters at Gloucester, the western capital. John had committed his son to the protection of the Holy See, and his share in the government was accordingly allowed to the papal legates, Gulo and Pandolf, both during the Civil War and for some time afterwards. But the title of regent was given by the loyal barons to William Marshal, the aged Earl of Pembroke, and Peter de Roche, the Poitevin Bishop of Winchester, received the charge of the king's person. The cause of the young Henry was fully vindicated by the end of 1217, defeated both by land and sea. The French prince renounced his pretensions and evacuated England, leaving the regency to deal with the more difficult questions raised by the lawless insolence of the royal partisans. Henry remained a passive spectator of the measures by which William Marshal, died 1219, and his successor, the justiciar Hubert de Burgh, asserted the royal prerogative against native barons and foreign mercenaries. In 1223, Honorius III declared the king of age, but this was a mere formality, intended to justify the resumption of the royal castles and domains which had passed into private hands during the Civil War. The personal rule of Henry III began in 1227 when he was again proclaimed of age. Even then he remained for some time under the influence of Hubert de Burgh, whose chief rival, Peter de Roche, found it expedient to quit the kingdom for 4 years. But Henry was ambitious to recover the continental possessions which his father had lost. Against the wishes of the justiciar, he planned and carried out an expedition to the west of France, 1230, and, when it failed, laid the blame upon his minister. Other differences arose soon afterwards. Hubert was accused, with some reason, of enriching himself at the expense of the crown, and of encouraging popular riots against the alien clerks for whom the papacy was providing at the expense of the English church. He was disgraced in 1232, and the power passed for a time into the hands of Peter de Roche, who filled the administration with Poitevins. So began the period of misrule by which Henry III is chiefly remembered. The Poitevins fell in 1234. They were removed at the demand of the barons and the primate Edmund Rich, who held them responsible for the tragic fate of the rebellious Richard Marshal. But the king replaced them with a new clique of servile and rapacious favorites. Disregarding the wishes of the Great Council, and excluding all the more important of the barons and bishops from office, he acted as his own chief minister, and never condensed to justify his policy except when he stood in need of subsidies. When these were refused, he extorted aids from the towns, the Jews, or the clergy, the three most defenseless bodies in the kingdom. Always in pecuniary straits through his extravagance, he pursued a foreign policy which would have been expensive under the most careful management. He hoped not only to regain the French possessions, but to establish members of his own family as sovereigns in Italy and the Empire. These plans were artfully fostered by the Savoyard kinsman of Eleanor, daughter of Raymond Berenger, Count of Provence, whom he married at Canterbury on January 14, 1236, and his half-brothers, the sons of Queen Isabella and Hugo, Count of La Manche. These favorites, not content with pushing their fortunes in the English court, encouraged the king in the wildest designs. In 1242 he led an expedition to Gascony, which terminated disastrously with the defeat of Teleborg, and hostilities with France were intermittently continued for 17 years. The Savoyards encouraged his natural tendency to support the papacy against the empire. Early in the period of misrule, he entered into a close alliance with Rome, which resulted in heavy taxation of the clergy, and gave great umbrage to the barons. A cardinal legate was sent to England at Henry's request, and, during 4 years, 1237 to 41, administered the English church in a manner equally profitable to the king and the pope. After the call of the legate Otho the alliance was less open and less cordial. Still, the Pope continued to share the spoils of the English clergy with the king, and the king to enforce the demands of the Roman tax collectors. Circumstances favored Henry's schemes. Archbishop Edmund Rich was timid and inexperienced. His successor, Boniface of Savoy, was a kinsman of the queen. Grosseteste, the most eminent of the bishops, died in 1253 when he was on the point of becoming a popular hero. Among the lay barons, the first place naturally belonged to Richard of Cornwall, who, as the king's brother, was unwilling to take any steps which might impair the royal prerogative, while Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, the ablest man of his order, was regarded with suspicion as a foreigner and linked to Henry's cause by his marriage with the Princess Eleanor. Although the Great Council repeatedly protested against the king's misrule and extravagance, their remonstrances came to nothing for want of leaders and a clear-cut policy. But between 1248 and 1252, Henry alienated Montfort from his cause by taking the side of the Gascons, whom the Earl had provoked to rebellion through his rigorous administration of their duchy. A little later, when Montfort was committed to opposition, Henry foolishly accepted from Innocent IV the crown of Sicily for his second son, Edmund Crouchback, 1255. Sicily was to be conquered from the Hohenstaufen at the expense of England, and Henry pledged his credit to the papacy for enormous subsidies, although years of comparative inactivity had already overwhelmed him with debts. On the publication of the ill-considered bargain, the baronage at length took vigorous action. They forced upon the king the provisions of Oxford, 1258, which placed the government in the hands of a feudal oligarchy. They reduced expenditure, expelled the alien favorites from the kingdom, and insisted upon a final renunciation of the French claims. The king submitted for the moment, but at the first opportunity endeavored to cancel his confessions. He obtained a papal absolution from his promises, and he tricked the opposition into accepting the arbitration of the French king Louis IX, whose verdict was a foregone conclusion, but Henry was incapable of protecting with the strong hand the rights which he had recovered by his double-dealing. Ignominiously defeated by Montfort at Luz, 1264, he fell into the position of a cipher, equally despised by his opponents and supporters. He acquiesced in the Earl's dictatorship, left to his eldest son, Edward, the difficult task of reorganizing the royal party, marched with the Montfortians to Evesham, and narrowly escaped sharing the fate of his jailer. After Evesham, 1265, he is hardly mentioned by the chroniclers. The compromise with the surviving rebels was arranged by his son in the concert with Richard of Cornwall and the legate Ottobuono. The Statute of Marlborough, 1267, which purchased a lasting peace by judicious concessions, was similarly arranged between Edward and the Earl of Gloucester. Edward was king in all but name for some years before the death of his father, by whom he was alternatively suspected and adored. Henry had in him some of the elements of a fine character. His mind was cultivated. He was a discriminating patron of literature, and Westminster Abbey is an abiding memorial of his artistic taste. His personal morality was irreproachable, except that he inherited the Plantagenet taste for crooked courses and dissimulation in political affairs. Even in this respect, the king's reputation has suffered unduly at the hands of Matthew Paris, whose literary skill is only equaled by his malice. The ambitions which Henry cherished, if extravagant, were never sordid. His patriotism, though seldom attested by practical measures, was thoroughly sincere. Some of his worst actions as a politician were due to a sincere, though exaggerated, gratitude for the support which the papacy had given him during his minority. But he had neither the training nor the temper of a statesman. His dreams of autocracy at home and far-reaching dominion abroad were anachronisms in a century of constitutional ideas and national differentiation. Above all, he earned the contempt of Englishmen and foreigners alike by the instability of his purpose. Matthew Paris said that he had a heart of wax. Dante relegated him to the limbo of ineffectual souls, and later generations have endorsed these scathing judgments. Henry died at Westminster on November 16, 1272. His widow, Eleanor, took the veil in 1276 and died at Amesbury on June 25th, 1291. Their children were the future King Edward I, Edward, Earl of Lancaster, Margaret, 1240-75, wife of Alexander III of Scotland, Beatrice, and Catherine.